Morning. Morning, my name is Darin Bartik. I'm with Dell. Some of you may have seen a little bit of news about Dell lately. We're in a bit of a transformation. That is not why I'm here today. Not going to talk about Dell's transformation. It's all secret anyway, so we can't talk about that. But what I am going to talk about is a little bit of the data conversation. And let's just go to the opening here. So a little bit of the conversation around data and how hopefully a little story that I'll tell can hopefully help you guys think about maybe how to transform your organization, your agency, and hopefully transform maybe the way that you approach data in driving your mission forward. So we have been bombarded the past few years with quotes and statements and facts about how much data there is in the world and how fast it's increasing. Eric Schmidt from Google 5 years ago talked about us generating enough data every 2 days, basically starting yesterday through tomorrow, enough information that it eclipsed the amount of information we started generating from the beginning of human existence all the way through 2003. That was 5 years ago, right? So whether that was an exact statement, whether it's more or less than that, we all can agree that we have a lot of data, right? We're also let's go back. We've also been thinking about and bombarded with statements like data is the new oil, and the data gold rush is on, and data science is bringing sexy back to IT, right? But my favorite, and I have to give this credit to another one of the vendors, not ourselves, data is the new bacon, because everything is better with bacon, right? Who would not agree with that, right? But the problem is that with all this data coming out and coming from so many different devices, Kyle's presentation earlier about the Internet of Things, data is coming from and going to basically everywhere, right? Peter talked about tweeting when he first got up here. We talked about connected cars, connected devices, etc. The sources and the destinations for our data is really overwhelming, right? The problem is we only have about 15% maybe of enough physical storage to hold everything that we're creating. And that percentage will probably go down as we create exponentially faster data. But we're still trying to keep as much data as we can. We've become data hoarders, right? And just like on the TV show Hoarders, that's not really a healthy thing, right? That's not a good way of doing things. We are keeping data just in case we need it. Not because we need it, not because we're doing something with it, but just in case. It's creating a really significant problem for all of us. A storage problem, certainly. A security problem, right? It's the biggest issue that we all have is the security problem. But it's also creating a challenge for the analysts and the users throughout our missions and our agencies that are trying to make use of the data, trying to make decisions with the data rather than just validating decisions that we've already made. Who's used data to just validate a decision that we already made, right? Again, as I think someone else said earlier, you're all lying if you haven't done that, right? So there must be a better way of doing this. There must be a better way of approaching this and getting past the idea and the hype of big data and really thinking about the idea of tapping into the right data, whether it's big or small, right? So there is a better way of doing this, and we need to think about that. We need to think about how do we get past this? How do we move past just amassing an amount of data and thinking about just maybe the answer will come out of that data magically, right? Let's just run some analytics. Let's see what we find, okay? That's not the best way to do it. There's a better way to do it, and it really starts with a question. And we'll talk a lot about a question today, okay? And what your question is, and what some of the questions are that have been asked and answered. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a group of people, because it's not data that creates answers. It's not data that creates context or a situation and moves us forward. It's really all of us. It's people that create answers, okay? Not the data. So let's talk about a group of people that have looked at the question that they need to answer in order to help. And how do they use data to do that, okay? How do they use data to answer that question, okay? So let's step back to the year 2000, okay? We can learn a lot from history, right? So let's step back to the year 2000. We had a situation where we were getting over the idea of the Y2K crisis. We had spent $300 billion on the Y2K crisis, and we had gotten to the point where it was, Okay, Y2K, a lot of money spent. But Time Warner and AOL, they were in the middle of a merger like someone else is at this time. So let's then talk about, okay, what else was happening in June 2000? President Bill Clinton and Prime Minister Tony Blair, they stood side by side at the White House on June 26th, and they released the first draft of the human genome to society. It had taken about 10 years and over $1 billion to do this work, okay? So let's step through the timeline real quickly of how we went from that to only 15 years later, where genomics is really changing the way we do medicine, the way we practice medicine, and the way we help patients one at a time. So in 2002, Dr. Jeff Trent started TGen, Translational Genomics Research Institute. Say that 3 times fast, right? Started TGen to look at how genomics can help cure diseases like neuroblastoma. It's a rare disease thought for a very long time to be incurable. It generally affects children under the age of 6, thousands of them across our world, okay? And how do we use genomics to treat these patients? In 2009, Dell was working with TGen, and we helped them build a system that was 1.2 teraflops in speed and 16-node computing cluster, big high-performance computing thing, really fast, right? That's impressive to some. I barely know what it means, right? It's really fast, okay? 12 times faster than what TGen had before. And what that allowed them to do was sequence the entire human genome in their labs. It was 3 billion marker pairs long and about 4 terabytes in size. So if you look at my genome and Goldie's genome and one other person in the room, you add all our genomes together, it's more data than the printed material in the US Library of Congress. That's pretty big data, right? This was before we even talked about the idea of big data. When we look at 2012, TGen partnered with an organization called the Neuroblastoma and Medulloblastoma Research Consortium, okay? NMTRC, okay? What they were doing together is they were really looking at trying to create better treatments for the patients of diseases like neuroblastoma and medulloblastoma, okay? And they were working together, they were using the data clusters and the performance systems to analyze and sequence one patient at a time and really looking for how to solve these problems. Treatment to biopsy at that time was about a month. In 2014, through partnering with other organizations like the National Cancer Institute, TGen and the NMTRC were able to get the treatment to biopsy down to about 3 weeks. And in 2015, this year, the FDA granted approval to start treatment of a neuroblastoma patient, again, most of them children, immediately after biopsy. And treatment had gone from a month or longer, and treatments had gone from really everyone being treated the same to more of a precision medicine approach, to treating each child uniquely based on their genome. So precision medicine had arrived, and as James Lowy, the head of technology at TGen said, this isn't really about time to value for us, it's about time to life. How many of us can say that? I know I generally can't say that in my job at Dell. It's not about time to value. We talk about ROI, but time to life is the compelling conversation. And here we have the people that made this happen. And this whole thing started with a question. You see Dr. Giselle Scholler. She was the chair of the NMTRC and director of pediatric oncology at the Helen DeVos Children's Hospital. She, working with Dr. Trent and James Lowy on the bottom there, she was working with a patient. He was 5 years old, a little boy. His name was Tyler. She told us that after about 6 months of really intensive chemotherapy, Tyler was going to die, okay? And Tyler's mother asked Dr. Scholler to sit down with Tyler's 2 brothers and explain to them why he was going to die and why they couldn't help. And obviously a really tough conversation. And it was really at that time that Dr. Scholler formed the strategic question that she needed to answer. How do we treat these patients differently? In fact, she talked about how do we rationally understand and learn how to treat each one of these patients uniquely. How do we treat them to the best outcome for each individual person? And I applaud them asking that question. And really, when you think about it, in order to solve this problem, you have to stay focused on the question. What they did is they sat back and they started to work with other organizations. TGen came to the conversation and said, how can we help? Okay? And since then, they've been able to get the treatments down to a few days, but most importantly, they've increased the survival rate by 60%. 60% of patients that were deemed incurable are now moving into remission and moving on to a better prolonged life. But they never lost sight of the question. Most of us aren't curing cancer in our daily jobs. Some of us are. Many of us, probably most of us, know someone with cancer, but we're not curing it. But we all can think about not losing sight of our question, not losing sight of the question that's the most important thing to solve, like Dr. Scholler and TGen, right? So, as we think about IT and business and in our agencies here in the room, and as we think about the mission moving forward, it's critical that we start with the question first. It's critical that we start with what are we trying to do, not the technology at hand, okay? And it's important that we do this together. With the IT leaders and the business leaders in our agencies and in our organizations, we need to help first ask this question, okay? And ask it together and focus on how do we do this together. It really comes down to some basic principles, I think. So much of what we do gets so wrapped up in, again, the hype and the technology that we adopt and how we adopt the latest thing. We forget some of the basic principles. Tying projects to goals. Again, the goal here is to answer that strategic question that we sit down and form ahead of time. Define and prioritize the use cases of that question. We can't do everything at once. We have to define and prioritize. And then, of course, set performance metrics around it. And there's one more thing that I would suggest we ask. It's a basic thing. Ask how you can help, right? The strategic question is oftentimes a very big question. But if we first start with something as easy as how can we help, then we may have something happen like the Turkish government. It's kind of interesting with what's happening this week with President Obama being in Turkey. How can we respond and rescue the most people in the event of another earthquake in Turkey? What we did is we sat down with the Turkish government and we helped them build a system where we were coordinating the traffic information and closed-circuit TV from around the city, and we helped them analyze and predict where the most people would be at any point in the day or night, so that the search and rescue organizations could be right on the spot in the most important areas as quickly as possible. The American Red Cross did a similar thing. Great organization. They asked a similar question of how we can get more information from affected areas during emergencies to help the most people. They knew that a lot of people use social media, Facebook, etc., to communicate with loved ones, to ask and to seek out help. And what they did is they really were able to leverage technology that Dell and other organizations had done as far as a social media command center. So we built their digital operations center. It was always on, it was always tracking social traffic, but it was able to be turned on in the event of emergency to really help them get to the people that needed it the most, the fastest. Once we come up with the question, we really need to sit down and think about a couple key technology things, right? The technology conversation is a complicated one, but it shouldn't come before the strategic question. We need to focus on the question first. So put that at the center of everything. And then think about your capabilities around analytics, okay? All of the organizations that I've talked about today, TGen, NMTRC, the doctors, the Turkish government, they're using analytics to move their organization forward and predict what's happening based on the right data and assembling that. If you're going to analyze data, you need to be able to integrate data. You need to pull it together, pull it from different places. And that integration and that preparation of data for analytics is oftentimes 80% of the problem, right? That's where we spend most of our time and energy. Let's simplify that. It's all running on platforms. All that data is stored in sometimes new repositories, sometimes traditional databases, etc. But we need to make sure that we're thinking about what we have before we start buying new, right? Our budget's not getting any bigger. not in the government, not in the enterprise either. And then the infrastructure that it all runs on, servers, storage, networking, et cetera. Look for scalable and look for open systems that don't require really expensive proprietary skill sets, right? And this can be done in a modular fashion. This can be done in a kind of a big moving fashion, but really I would suggest the modular way is the best way to go, the agile approach to this, okay? So after we think about the technology and after we think about the question, it's really time to make sure that we've addressed the cultural implications, because these are hard things, right? We need to think about how we address this from the top down. We need executive sponsorship in these conversations to not only come up with the question, but to stay focused on the question for longer than a few months, okay? We all have very short attention spans because everything's moving so quickly. Stay focused on your question, but also help the users from the bottom up. Help them develop the skill of making a decision using data, not just supporting the decisions that they've already made, right? This is a critical thing. The other thing that I would say about users, and I being one of them, I think all of us are users, we need to make sure that we're collaborating with our partners and sharing data across our silos, sharing data across our agencies in order to complete a bigger mission. So let's learn from Dr. Scholler and James and Dr. Trent and think about starting with a strategic question. Get to the technology later, okay? Partner. Work with other experts around the organizations, around the agencies, in the commercial sector, partnering public and private, and share the data, okay? If data is really the new economy asset, then we need to share it and make the most of it. So, let me close, because I'm already a couple minutes over and I apologize. I'm kind of passionate about this conversation, as you might tell. So, Goldie, FedScoop, thanks for having me here, and thank all of you for your attention today. I want to leave you with one more thing. My wife tells me that I ask too many questions, which is kind of ironic given my speech today. But when she would come to me with a problem, when she would come to me with something that she was having trouble with in her business, she runs a small business, and she would want to sit down and talk through it with me, I would start asking her question after question. I would interrogate her like I worked at Langley all year, right? And the problem is that I would start asking her questions really before I knew what the problem was. If we don't know what the problem is, we can't ask the right questions. We can't formulate the strategic questions to really make a big difference. So I'm going to leave you with a question rather than action, okay? And I'd like to say that this question is pretty easy. We are in a predominantly gentleman audience, right? Because it's all IT, of course. So guys, pay attention, because I use this with my wife now, pretty much as I can. And it's pretty simple, and it works pretty well. I've actually started to use it with my kids. When they start to misbehave, I use it as a leader at Dell. I use it with my team as much as I can, and I would encourage you to use it as much as possible. As the leaders that will transform government and transform business and transform the economy, transform, it's probably the best word of the day. I think I've heard it the most out of any other word. As we sit down and try to transform the lives of patients like Tyler and the health of our nation, I would ask you to ask this question as much as you can. Start with this question, and it can really help you stay on the right path. Thank you.